Hello friends, and welcome again to a Walk in the Garden Bible study. This is part 2 in our study of Genesis chapter 39. And we've been looking at the case of Joseph. And we left off with verse 12 of chapter 39 in our last lesson. And if you remember, Joseph had found himself in a desperate situation. We saw where he had worked his way up in the house of Potiphar. And the Lord was with him. The Lord was blessing him greatly and blessing all of his efforts, blessing all of his doings. And Potiphar noticed it. He noticed how prosperous he had become because of Joseph. It was because on behalf of Joseph being in his household. And so he basically worked his way up the ladder, and it got to the point where we noticed where Potiphar had turned his entire operation, his entire household operation, and all of his business doings, and just basically had everything underneath the leadership and direction of Joseph. And then we saw where the only thing in the whole, as Joseph pointed out, the only thing in Potiphar's whole household that was withheld from Joseph, that he didn't have access to, was Potiphar's own wife. And we noticed that through the times that had been taking place, that Potiphar's wife had been eyeing Joseph, and she'd been eyeballing him, she'd been lusting after him, she'd been seeking to get alone with him, and her desire was to have him to come in to her and have relationships with her in their own house. And so that's what she'd been trying to do, and it told us that she'd been basically just coming on to him daily, on a daily basis, just time after time. She was relentless in her advances toward him and her efforts towards him in order to get him to submit to her desires. And he was refusing to do so. He said, no, I can't do that, because that would be, I'd be dismantling what I've established here. I'd be dishonoring my master, your very husband. But beyond that, I would be sinning against God. It's just something that God would not approve of, and it would be a sin against God, and I'm not going to do it. And so that's where he took a stand. He took a stand for righteousness, and he was not going to compromise his testimony or his standing within the household. He just wasn't going to do it. But as we saw, in that type of a situation, and we were kind of comparing it with modern day of sexual harassment. And sexual harassment's one thing that can be dealt with, but if it was the boss that was committing the harassment, or the boss's wife, then it's a whole nother level of situation, because they have power that they can fire you, they can take you down, they can, drag you through the dirt, and what they say is going to go. And so you're in a situation where your very livelihood is being threatened, and it becomes a complicated thing to be able to take that firm of a stand in the face of that type of adversity. But that's where Joseph had found himself. And so the next thing we noticed was where Potiphar's wife had set up an environment and a situation that was going to be conducive to her getting what she wished for. She sent all of the servants out of the household. She knew that Joseph would come in that day to take care of business. And when he did, then it was just them two alone in the house. And she came on to him and verbatim put her advances upon him very vehemently that day. And what do we see next? Well, it says they got in kind of to a confrontation. And she was really pushing herself on him to the point where she laid her hands on him and tried to pull him towards her. And when she did, he just saw no alternative but just to turn and to get out of the situation, to run away. But as he did, what do we see? Well, it says that she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." And he left his garment in her hand and fled, and got him out. So he was trying to do the right thing. He didn't know what any other alternative. He wasn't going to abuse her. He wasn't going to have domestic violence against her. He wasn't going to be accused of doing anything but by laying hands on her. And the only way he could get out of that situation was just to escape out of it as quick as possible, and then suffer the consequences later. And that's what we're going to see, because what happened was he left in such haste, and she had hold of his garment she wasn't going to let go, that he left it there in her very hands. And so there's something to be said about not, or at least attempting to not put yourself in a compromising environment, in compromising situations. And we talked about that to some extent, that whether it's in the workplace, or whether it's out in the community, or whether, it could be something as simple as you're driving down the road and you see somebody that you know but they're of the opposite sex. Well, maybe you need to choose not to give them a ride by yourself, because again, that could be misconstrued. That could be, something could be said about that if somebody observed it. And there's just different situations. You could take somebody out to eat, and it could be an innocent enough situation, but likely, we have to avoid the appearance of evil, because things can, rumors can start, things can get out of hand, and things can, there can be a backlash in your very own family without, you even trying to accomplish anything evil. But that's the way things can happen. So we have to be in a constant state of awareness of our surroundings, but also of different just daily activities and situations that we're doing. And there's a lot of times when we can make choices that will avoid putting ourselves in a possible compromising situation. And so there's something to be said for that, but it's a hard thing to do, and it can't always be accomplished, because in this situation, Joseph still had a job to do. He still had his daily duties to do, and he'd been trying to avoid her. He'd been trying to avoid being in the presence of her and being, anywhere around her, but it got to the point where it was unavoidable. It was going to hinder him from doing his daily duties. And so it was a very hard thing for him to avoid. And so here it was. He found himself in that difficult situation. But even though the opportunity presented itself, which he could have easily have gave in and caved in and said, well, nobody will know. She's promised she wouldn't, relay this to anybody, and nobody's in the house, and I can do this. She'll be pleased. Maybe get it over with, and then move on, and maybe that'll satisfy the whole thing. He could have done that, but he would not cave for several reasons. First of all, what did we notice? Well, he would not wrong his master. He was bound by honor. He was bound by justice and gratitude. What does he say? He says, there is none greater in this house than I. He was thankful for his position, and he maintained it with all gravity. He would not do anything to tarnish his standing with his boss. And that's what we should do. If we have somebody that's treating us fairly, they've been kind to us, they've given us promotions, they've looked out for us, then why on earth would we ever want to do anything to burn that bridge, so to speak, or to tarnish that relationship that we have with them? I mean, they've put all their trust in us, they put their faith in us to do the right things. And if you're in a working environment and you're in control, or you're the manager, or maybe the owner of the business, sometimes it's hard to find people that you can put that much confidence in that aren't related to you. You don't know them on a personal level, but you've observed them, you've noticed their working habits, you've noticed their work ethics, and it's hard to find somebody like that, but when you do, you're happy to give them that promotion. You're happy to give them extra responsibilities and commitments, and you're happy to be able to delegate your authority to them, knowing that it's in capable hands. And as long as they don't ever do anything that would harm that reputation or hinder that, then they can pretty much work for you as long as they want to, and you're happy to have them work there. And so he saw that with all gratitude, and he wanted to honor his master. Secondly, he would not offend God. He knew that this would be the wrong thing to do. It would be a sinful thing to do. It would be against the will and the word of God. It would be a crime. It would be a sinful action. And how could he possibly consider doing such wickedness, especially when it's his own master's wife? Yet to some folks, it could seem maybe such a small matter, and maybe something to take lightly. What's the big deal? Who's it going to harm? Who's it going to hurt? I mean, she wants to have that relationship, so give her what she wants, make her happy. Maybe good things will result out of that. Maybe you'll get more wealth. Maybe she can talk to him to give you a better promotion. Maybe you can go even farther up the ladder somehow, or maybe come into some other type of riches or material gain as a result of her speaking to the master if she's on good terms with you. I mean, she has the power and authority to do that. But to Joseph, this was a monumental thing that she was asking. What does it say? It says, therefore, it says, he hearkened not unto her to lie by her or even to be with her. I mean, he was just avoiding of being around her. He didn't even want to be close to her. He didn't want to be in her presence. He wanted to keep his distance. He was trying to avoid her at all costs. And we talked about that to some extent. If there's a temptation that you know you're going to be confronted with, if you go into a certain place or see you're going to be exposed to a certain thing, but if you can avoid that, just completely avoid it, then that's the best way to escape that, from the possibility of having a compromising moment in your life. Is just to avoid going down that aisle, to avoid going to see that particular person, or avoid going to that person's house, or being in that group that is going to have the get together later on, and there's going to be some things there that will be possibly a temptation, or possibly could compromise your testimony. Well, sometimes it's best just to say, no, I'm not going to do it, and take the risk of being excommunicated from that group perhaps, or being shunned by them, or being looked down upon by them, but you've protected your testimony, and you've protected your relationship and your fellowship with the Lord. And He's not going to take that lightly. He's going to honor that in your life, and He's going to see to it that good things are going to be the result. So what was the result? Well, we see that she laid hands on him. She took hold of his garment, and then we saw where he had to escape in such a urgent manner that he left his garment behind, which is going to come back to haunt him. But he just didn't know what else to do. He couldn't be there any longer. And perhaps, we don't know, perhaps he was feeling a little bit of temptation. Perhaps he was feeling a little bit of the sense of, well, mate, she is rather attractive, and she does really like me, and she is, really seductive, and, maybe he was starting to sweat a little bit and starting to feel a little bit of those inner emotions, and those, the fleshly lust might have been starting to creep up on him, and he knew that he had to get out of there just as quick as possible. So that could be. But for either way, that's what he did. And either way, he escaped so quick that he left his garment behind. And she would no longer suggest, but she was to the point that she was persistent. She was going to coerce him, and she was seeking to convince him to do this thing, because it was almost like a demand, lie with me. It wasn't in the form of a question. It wasn't in the form of, well, here's an option for you, or here's something you might want to consider. It was like, I'm telling you right now, lie with me. I want you to do this thing, and I'm no longer being friendly about it. Now I'm being demanding. And in his haste to escape, he left his garment in her hand and fled, and got him out. That's a good way to put it. But he would not so much stay to consider the offer. He sought to get out of there, and without further offending her or taking a chance of laying hands on her, that's what he did. In his mind, it was better to lose a good coat than lose a good conscience. Well, with that, we're going to pick it up in verses 13 through 18 and basically see if we can finish out chapter 39. And the Bible says, and it came to pass, when he saw that he had left his garment in her hand and was fled forth, that she called unto the men of her house, and spake unto them, saying, See, he hath brought in a Hebrew to mock us. He came in unto me to lie with me, and I cried with a loud voice. And it came to pass, when he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me, and fled, and got him out. And she laid up his garment by her until her Lord came home. And she spake unto him according to these words, saying, The Hebrew servant, which thou hast brought unto us, came in unto me to mock me. And it came to pass, as I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled out. Well, she had a scheme. She was going to get her vengeance upon Joseph for his basically jilting her for his turning down her request, and she just couldn't believe that he wouldn't give in to her demands. And so even though that Joseph has elected to do the right thing, his mistress, having tried in vain to make him a criminal, now endeavors to represent him as one. Now he's going to be represented. And sometimes that's the way it is. You do the right thing, you choose to do the right thing, and as a result, somebody can, they'll connive against you possibly. They'll use deception. They'll use falsehoods to make it look like you're in the wrong. And there's times when you could even be fired from your position, or you can even be demoted, or you can be possibly even charged with a crime that you didn't commit. And it happens all the time. And if people are good at what they do, they can make it look like you're the bad guy, even though you were doing the right thing. And think about it. Who's Potiphar most likely going to believe? Is he going to believe Joseph, or is he going to believe his wife? I mean, that's kind of calling him on the carpet. He may think that Joseph didn't do this thing, or think that possibly that's hard to believe. But hey, if my wife says it, it must be true. We've been married all this time. We trust each other. She's not got any reason to lie to me. But she wants revenge for being jilted. How dare Joseph deny her for what she wants? How dare he reject her because of who she is? And so what does she do? Well, she first of all, she tells the servants what has taken place. She needs some witnesses, even though there were none. And the servants aren't going to say otherwise. The servants are going to do exactly as they're told. I mean, they're got to be protective of their positions. So they're going to be obedient to their master, or even to his wife. They're going to back her up. But she tells them, hey, this is what happened. He tried to molest me. He tried to seduce me. I cried out with a loud voice. He got worried. He got scared and ran out. And see, I've got his jacket here as proof that he was here in my very room, in my very parlor, trying to do this thing. So she accused him to the servants. She gave him a bad name among them, and she sought to build her case, as any deceptor would. She ought to have witnesses to the supposed crime, and she sought to accuse him of the guilt that was actually belonged to her. Everything that she was trying to do, she was accusing him of being the one trying to do it. And that's the way that deception is. That's the way that people are. It's called projection. They want to project their guilt onto somebody else. They want to have a scapegoat. They want somebody that they can put their, make it look like they're in the wrong, even though they're the very ones that are doing it. We see that a lot in politics today. People are doing the bad and the worst things, and then they try to make it out the other side, or the other person, the one that they're against, to be the bad guy, doing the very thing that they're guilty of. And a lot of times they get away with it. Secondly, we see that she accuses him to her master, who, the master had the power in his hand to punish him. So she accuses him to Joseph's master. And so while his servants did not have any power over him to do that, she wanted revenge for Joseph, what she saw slighting her in the worst way. I mean, she was embarrassed. She'd been put down. How dare him? Nobody puts her down. Nobody, lowers herself. Nobody, she's always gotten every desire that she ever wished. I mean, how dare him? Especially an outsider that was brought in, a Hebrew servant of all things, that's going to come in and mock her. How dare him be able to do that? He basically rejected her come-ons and advances. He withstood her seduction, and basically he just blew her off. And nobody's ever done that to her before. And she wasn't going to take it lying down. He would not get away with it, and she will plead her case with her husband. And so what do we see? Well, we see that she fabricates this story that she's going to tell. Her side of the case. It's going to be that Joseph sought to seduce her by force. And the only reason he didn't accomplish it is because she cried out with such a loud voice, and he was afraid the servants were going to come in and catch him in the very act. What trash had Potiphar brought into this household? What dirt bag? What a scumball? What, for lack of better terms. What a trash that he had brought in now, and this lowlife that's going to come in and try to have a relationship with his very wife. And he was a Hebrew. He thought he could he thought he could throw his weight around and have anything he wanted. He got put in that position. Now he thinks he's got so much power that he can even have power over her. He's a mocker. And the only reason he quickly fled was because of her cries for help. And then next we see that she provided the proof to Potiphar. She provided proof that her story was true and factual. He was so afraid and left in such a rush that he left his garment behind. And here it is. I'm not making this up. Look. Is this his garment or not? Sure it is. I hold the very garment that he was wearing just moments ago. And how else would I have obtained that if my story wasn't true? And so it was that she prepared to plead her case before her husband. What does it tell us? It says she laid up the garment by her until his Lord came home. She couldn't wait for his arrival. She's probably tapping her fingers. She's probably pacing back and forth. She's going over in her head and in her mind over and over and over the words that she's going to say. She's reminding the servants that are there, well, remember now what I told you, what happened. If he asked you, remember that. Remember, you got to back me up on this. She's not going to take this thing lightly. And punishment would most likely have to be severe and teach Joseph a lesson, a valuable lesson. And so when Potiphar returned, what does it say? It says, she spake to him according to these words, saying, the Hebrew servant, which thou hast brought unto us, came in unto mock me. And it came to pass, as I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled out. Well, what was her case? Well, first of all, she says, you. She says, you brought this unscrupulous person into our household. It wasn't my idea. I didn't I didn't interview him. I didn't give him my approval. I didn't, scrutinize him. He didn't have his references with him. We weren't able to check him out. But you brought him this foreigner that you purchased that we knew very little about. We don't know any background on him. He might be an axe murderer for all we know. He might be a rapist. He might be, have a history of abusing women. We just don't know. We don't know anything about it. But you brought him in our household, and you brought him not in just your household, but you brought him into us. You put me in a compromising position. You put me in a vulnerable position, because there's times when I have to be in the household along with him. And then this particular day, I was in there by myself with him. And I was vulnerable. And he took advantage of that situation. So you're the one that prompted this predicament, husband. In other words, he's a detriment and a mockery, not only just upon me, but upon you as well. I was nearly violated by this man, and he cannot be trusted. He sought to do folly right under your nose because you had turned a deaf ear, weren't watching him anymore, weren't keeping him in check, and you gave him so much power and ability that he felt like he could have his way with anybody that he wanted to, even me. And secondly, the only reason it didn't happen is because I fought to get away. I fought tooth and nail to get away from this man. He was trying hard to seduce me. He was trying to get me in a compromising position. And I had to fight for my life and scream and shout and yell and claw. And finally, fortunately, I was able to get out of that situation. But I still have this garment as evidence against him. Now, what are you going to do about it? We've got to take action. We've got to set him up as an example. Otherwise, you're going to be, people are just not going to trust that you've got any handle on your household. You've got no ability to control your servants. It'll be like a snowball effect. The other servants will see what's happened, and if he gets away with it, then they're going to think, well, surely we can get away with things too. But it's ironic that this is the second time that Joseph's jackets were used against him. You remember the first was when his brothers took the jacket off his back, sold him into slavery, and then used that as evidence that their story was the truth, that he'd been scooped up by some wild animals and was probably dead. And then secondly, now we see that his jacket's being used against him again in order to back up the story as proof that he tried to do this crime against Potiphar's wife. And so that's where we're at. But in verses, we're going to pick it up there in verses 19 through 23, and it says, "And it came to pass, when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spake unto him, saying, After this manner did thy servant unto me, that his wrath was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison. But the Lord was with Joseph, and showed him mercy, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison. And whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper." Well, you can't keep a good man down. No matter what situation you're in, if the Lord is with you, you're bound to prosper. You're bound to have success. You're bound, if you're doing the Lord's will, God is going to honor that, and you're going to succeed in all of your endeavors. But we see, what is Potiphar's response to the news that was given to him? Well, he took his wife's word for it. He wanted to maintain peace in the household. And again, he may have suspected maybe she wasn't telling the whole story. He may have suspected, it might have been hard for him to believe that after all this time and all these successes that Joseph's had, that all of a sudden he would turn on him like this and do this thing. But she may have made a convincing case. And he's aware how Joseph was a good-looking guy, and how he might have, and how maybe his wife was attractive, and how that could have been the situation. Well, he took her word for it. And even though he was possibly a little reluctant, he was very angry over Joseph seemingly attempting to stab him in the back, and by overstepping his bounds and by seeking to take liberties with his own wife. What does it say? It says, "When his master heard the words of his wife, which she spake unto him, saying, After this manner did thy servant to me, that his wrath was kindled." And rightfully so. Any man who is under suspicion that somebody's trying to take liberties with his wife, well, yeah, your wrath is going to be kindled, and you're going to want to do something about it. You're going to want to handle and take care of the situation, no doubt. And so he believed the accusation, and either Joseph lied and tried to cover up the situation, or Potiphar just simply would not hear his case, one or the other. But for either way, what does it tell us? It says he put him into prison, and it's a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison. But his fate could just as easily have been much worse. I mean, under justification of the law, he could have been put to death for such a crime. So he'd still showed him an element of mercy, even though those prisons were no decent place to be stuck in. And where was he put? It says that he was put where the king's prisoners were bound, and so it was a pretty severe prison. And it was one where the worst of the worst criminals would be bound up and put inside and just pretty much treated pretty roughly, and not really have too good of accommodations by no means. But as a swift punishment, and now we see it was a swift punishment taken upon his loyal servant Joseph, who was nothing but loyal to him the whole time he was in his presence. Well, we're going to have to leave off there, but we'll finish off these verses as we get ready to enter into chapter 40. And we're going to see now that Joseph's in prison. But as I said, it's tough to keep a good man down, because we're going to see the Lord's hand. It doesn't matter if he's in the king's house or the master's house. It doesn't matter if he's in prison. The Lord's hand is still upon him, and it's still going to be evident in his actions and his doings and in his life. And we're going to see that even though he's in prison, he's still going to prosper, and it's going to be taken noted of, and he's going to be put back in a different position of authority even while he's in prison. So we'll pick it up there in our next lesson. Hope to see you then. Hope you're having a great day, and we'll talk to you again soon. Thanks.